way Gary Sims at the Department of Justice stacks his tubes?
Yes.
How does he do it?
Gary Sims places the rack with one tube, and then he leaves 2 or 3 spaces, another tube. He leaves plenty of space between every tube so that there's no possibility, if you go in there with your fingers or a glove, of touching one tube to the other, or of the tubes touching one another.
All right. And these are the same kind of tubes that we're talking about when you pull off the tops that you get aerosols.
Sustain.
Just 2 more. What is this picture of? We'll mark this 13, I think we're up to 1306. And 1307. Well, 1306, what is this a picture of?
This is a picture of the Scheck extraction solution. It's used for DNA extraction. It's located in that chemical fume hood that we saw a few moments ago.
And who directed you to this? Mr. Yamauchi?
Mr. Yamauchi.
All right. And could we zoom in here on the label on that bottle? Is there a date there that has some significance?
Yes, there is.
What is that?
It's 9/12/94 is the date that is on the chemical. Refers to the date in which it was made up. And we were visiting this laboratory on January 18th. At least these pictures were taken on January 18th, 1995. That indicates that this particular chemical has been there a number of months and has been used over and over those months.
Is that a good laboratory practice?
Especially not in PCR.
Lack of foundation. Also speculation.
Sustain. Answers. Last 2 answers are stricken.
The solution here, what is it?
Scheck is a solution that's used in the DNA extraction procedure.
Are you familiar with how the Scheck solution is used in the DNA extraction procedure at LAPD according to their protocol, and at other forensic labs and in other clinical labs?
Yes.
Oral.
Yes, I am.
And how is it, what does the term aliquot mean?
Aliquot means taking a large bottle like this and splitting it into very small tubes so that there's a smaller amount of material, smaller solution amount in those tubes.
How is the Scheck dealt with at the Cellmark laboratory?
The Scheck solution in Cellmark is made up fresh weekly.
And you determined that when you took a tour in connection with this case?
Yes, I did.
All right. And in your judgment, is a sound laboratory practice to keep the Scheck solution, at least indicated here, to be using it from 9/12/94 through what, January 18th, 95?
Objection, lack of foundation, calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Well, what is the terms of DNA laboratory methods? Is there a problem with using a Scheck solution from the same bottle for a substantial period of time?
Objection, unintelligible.
I understand it, but same objection. I think there's some people in the audience who want to step out. All right, that objection is overruled, but it does assume facts that aren't in evidence. This particular date is subject to interpretation. There are 2 different ways you can interpret that date, counsel. All right, let's take our recess at this point. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please remember all my admonitions to you will be in recess for 15 minutes. All right, Dr. Gerdes, you can step down.
On each item, you would tend to aliquot it into smaller volumes so that you don't go into that bottle a long time. The amount that's shown in this bottle is a 6-month supply.
Excuse me, objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
And why is it why, if you went into the bottle many times, in terms of contamination, does that have any consequences?
Yes, every time you open the bottle, there's a chance of something falling in there. Every time you pipette or put a pipetter into that bottle, there's a chance of introducing something accidentally. So it goes back to the manipulation we talked about earlier. The more you manipulate things, the more you go in and out of them, the higher the risk. Every time you open, there's a risk, and even the more times you open it, the greater the risk.
Have you reviewed records in connection with the hybridization sheets from the Los Angeles Police Department as to lots of Chelex? Have you done
Yes,
that?
yes.
Now, up here on this particular bottle, there's a number 5. What does that represent?
That's their lot number.
All right. Have you looked at lot numbers on the laboratory sheets with respect to the use of Chelex at the lab?
Yes.
And what is the frequency, in general terms, of how often they go to a new lot?
The lot numbers are used, the same lot numbers recorded for DNA extractions over a period of months.
Is that a good practice in your opinion?
No.
This is 1307. What is this picture of, Dr. Gerdes?
This is another reagent. This particular reagent called TE buffer is used to resuspend DNA.
And whose TE buffer is this, if we can go a little
That-
tighter on this picture?
You'll notice there's a CY on the bottle, so this is Colin Yamauchi's.
And so this picture was taken at his workstation?
At his workstation, yes.
And again, how much TE buffer is used in the course of running a DNA test?
Less than a drop.
And is this another kind of reagent that ought to be aliquoted?
Yes.
And what is the date on this particular picture?
5/25/93,
And when was this picture taken?
January 18th, 1995.
Now, I'd like to show you prosecution's 287, I believe, entitled "Was PCR DNA Typing, Los Angeles Police Department." Now, this first set of pictures under the title Piper Tech Extraction, is that picture Mr. Amauchi?
Yes.
And this is the workstation you were just referring to?
Yes.
And what does this depict?
This is the area in which he would set up his DNA extractions.
Now, this is in the serology lab room,
Yes,
and this is at the Piper Tech location.
correct.
All right. Now, in terms of designing DNA laboratories using PCR, what importance is there in terms of structuring the flow of work from the point that the sample is first taken into the lab to the end of the process?
Well, in this process, you recall you start with a small amount of DNA, and then after you've gone through the amplification process, you end up with a very large amount of DNA. So if you can maintain a one-way flow so that you always go from the smaller to the larger and never back, it reduces the risk of crossover of the high amount to the low amount, which we've talked about a number of times. But basically, by designing the laboratory in such a way that you only have a one-way flow of low DNA concentration to high and never back, it's another procedure that's used by laboratories to try and reduce the risk of contamination.
So this first picture where it shows pipetech extraction, that takes place in the serology lab.
Yes,
And the samples have come from that evidence processing room, the one with the garage, goes up and down. They go
Correct.
into this room, is that correct?
correct?
Now, the next picture down on the PCR DNA typing board shows pictures called preamplification, amplification, hybridization of photography.
Yes,
And those are at the Parker Center?
correct.
All right, could you tell us where that is and how we get from Pipertech at the extraction phase to the Parker Center for the amplification
So Parker
phase?
Center is actually located 1 to 2 miles from Piper Tech. It's a totally different building, so it's definitely separated. The amplification is set up in one room, the pre-amplification room. That's where the tubes and the reagents are all mixed together, and then it's amplified and hybridized in a second.
All right, now, after, when you do the amplification, is that where you produce the greater amounts of DNA that's sometimes called the amplicons?
Correct.
All right. Now, the next step here in this board indicates that Pipertech product gel electrophoresis. And there's been testimony that, from Mr. Yamauchi, that DNA samples are then taken back to Pipertech into a room where they are then put on this PCR product gel.
Correct.
And did he walk you through that process?
Yes, he did.
And did you observe those rooms in that setup?
Yes, I did.
Is bringing the amplicons, or the PCR product, back into Pipertech consistent with the process of having a one-way workflow?
No, because you see, you've gone from low DNA, and right at this step, you've created high DNA by amplifying it. And this is at a different location, totally different building. But now they turn around and they go back to this building. So they're carrying back high levels of DNA into the area where there should be only low levels of DNA.
Are you familiar with the setup at the Department of Justice in terms of the flow of work?
Yes,
Do you recall the testimony of Gary Sims with respect to stating that after amplification, that PCR product never leaves the amplification room in that laboratory?
yes,
Is that true here at LAPD?
no,
Is this a good and sound laboratory practice?
no.
My apologies, Your Honor, I misread it. It's, that board is actually 281.
All right. Rather than 287.
Yes.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, there's been substantial testimony in this case with respect to substrate controls that were used for the Bundy blood drops, LAPD items 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52.
Yes,
Are you familiar with that testimony?
I am.
All right. Now, first of all, let me ask you, were any substrate controls taken from the glove that, the Rockingham glove that Mr. Yamauchi analyzed on June 14th?
No,
So, would it be fair to say that substrate controls cannot be used as a check against cross-contamination with respect to that glove?
that's correct.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, does the fact that testing of the Bundy blood drop substrate controls by LAPD, DOJ, and Cellmark did not reveal the presence of DNA prove that there was no cross-contamination of these samples?
Objection, no foundation, still to the witness expertise.
Sustain.
All right. Are you familiar with the testimony of Mr. Sims, of Mr. Yamauchi, that substrate controls were typed?
Yes,
Did you review that data?
yes,
Did you review the data and the testimony with respect to what happened to those substrate controls from the time that they first arrived to the laboratory, according to Fung and Mazzola, what Mr. Yamauchi did with them, where they were sent and when to Cellmark and the Department of Justice?
yes, I
Have you
reviewed all
reviewed
that.
that data?
I reviewed that.
Have you reviewed the test results on those substrate controls?
Yes, I have.
All right. Having reviewed the data from those substrate controls, do you believe that the fact that testing on those revealed the presence of DNA?
Same objection.
Sustain.
Did you review the laboratory work concerning tests performed on the substrate controls at LAPD, the Department of Justice, and Cellmark?
Yes, I did.
All right. What were those results?
The substrate controls appeared clean.
All right. Does the fact that the substrate controls appear clean prove in your mind that there was no cross-contamination of the samples 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52?
Same objection, also speculation.
Overruled.
No.
Why?
Well, there's a number of reasons. Number one, as we mentioned earlier in the NRC report and in my evaluation of the numerous runs at LAPD, it's not unusual to have that particular control not show a contaminant, even though other items in that run had a contaminant. And you'll recall we showed you that on the example of the 4 contamination earlier this morning.
In terms of these substrate controls, is there something known in molecular biology and analytical chemistry that's known as carrier or stabilizer?
Yes.
Could you describe what that is?
When one is working with molecules in very small concentrations, very small amounts, if you do this in a laboratory, you need to store them in the presence of something called a carrier. If you don't store them in the presence of something called a carrier, they tend to disappear. You lose them. Things, when they're too small in amounts, they can stick to the size of the bottle. There's unknown things in that solution that they're not quite stable. You just basically tend to lose it. So if you're looking at something analytically that's in a very small concentration, it's a standard practice that you add something called a carrier. In the case of DNA, what that would mean is you would add a non-human DNA to sort of stabilize the situation, such as salmon sperm DNA. And that would stabilize very small amounts of DNA so that they wouldn't disappear.
If you was, Dr. Gerdes, let me ask you to assume that the swatches from samples 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52 were degraded by bacteria, and that what was on those swatches was bacterial DNA. Do you have that in mind?
Yes.
And that subsequent to that, those swatches and perhaps control swatches were contaminated with foreign DNA.
Yes.
In terms of this carrier principle, what would the effect be in terms of the DNA that fell on the swatches with bacterial contamination as opposed to the blank swatches?
The back.
No foundation calls for speculation.
Sustain.
All right. Let's start with this hypothetical. Assume that you have a red swatch, such as the ones that you use in this case, and the DNA from blood on that swatch has been degraded and it's no longer human DNA, it's bacterial DNA.
Yes.
Can that act in a way that's similar to the non-human DNA you were talking about as a carrier?
Yes, it can.
Sorry, no foundation, speculation, Your Honor.
Sustain.
Ask this, I think I asked this a hypothetical, Your Honor?
It was, but there has to be a foundation for the expertise to give that opinion.
Dr. Gerdes, how can you tell us more about your experience with using carrier non-human DNA and how that affects other DNA going onto that non-human DNA? What's your experience with that?
Well, you recall I talked about the fact that we work with this virus called cytomegalovirus. And it turns out that when we looked at that virus in transplant patients, since they're immunosuppressed, a significant percentage of those patients tend to shed that virus, and it's present in their blood, and you find it, and in low levels. Now the problem then became you're finding it too often. We need to identify which patient needs to be treated. So we developed a quantitative PCR. And for that quantitative PCR, I needed to develop standards that could be used as quantitative standards that were stable and could be run over and over so that I could measure the amount of CMV in the patient versus these standards. In the process of creating the standards, it became obvious that a carrier DNA was required to maintain the stability of those DNAs. Now that's my personal experience with a specific incident. It's well known in other publications, other analytical procedures that this is a very common procedure.
All right.
I'm sorry, objection, calling for hearsay.
Now, what carrier did you use with the human DNA of the cytomegalovirus?
We use something you can purchase called salmon sperm DNA.
Is that salmon sperm DNA commonly used as a carrier?
Yes, that's why it's sold commercially for molecular biologists.
All right. Now, if you assume that the blood swatches in this case were degraded and consisted of bacterial DNA, could that bacterial DNA act as a carrier?
Yes.
Objection, no foundation, calls for speculation.
And as a consequence, if you assume that bacterial DNA was acting as a carrier, would that account for cross-contamination showing up in greater amounts on the stained items that consisted of, under our hypothetical, of bacterial DNA as opposed to the blank swatches?
Objection, calls for speculation.
Yes, that would explain it, because on the swatch that has nothing on it, there's no stabilizer, therefore you would lose the small amount of contaminant. On the swatch with the bacterial DNA, there is a stabilizer, and therefore it would remain there.
Now, are you familiar with Mr. Sims's testimony with respect to his view of the role that the substrate controls played as a check against cross-contamination?
Yes.
Are you familiar with his answers to the questions that, as far as he was concerned, the substrate controls would have to run strictly in parallel with the other stained items to be a check against cross-contamination?
Yes.
All right. Now,
I'm sorry, objection misstates the evidence.
what do you understand that assumption of running in parallel to mean? What does it mean to you?
Well, again, the image of transferring from one item to the next by handling it. One control for that would be when you handle something with a large amount of DNA, the next item you handle has no DNA. So if that happened, you would pick it up there. And then the next item would have DNA, and then the next item would have no DNA, and then the next item would have, and so forth. You alternate between a sample that has DNA or should have DNA and a sample that has no DNA. So that's what's meant by running them in parallel. It's more like in series, really. You have to alternate a sample with DNA and a sample without DNA. And that should control for this cross-transfer.
Now, In your review of the way that the substrate controls were handled in this case, did you see evidence that they were not handled strictly in parallel in terms of how LAPD distributed them?
Yes.
And what was that?
Well, these items at one point were sent to two other laboratories, Cellmark Laboratories and the Department of Justice. And this process of handling in parallel or in series, whichever you want to look at it, and as we described, that has to occur all the way from the very moment you start with an item till you get a result, and it doesn't matter what lab you do it in, it has to happen, it has to be sort of a chain of custody, it has to follow that flow at all times. When the LAPD mailed their specimens, the evidence items, to both DOJ and to Cellmark, they failed to mail the controls, the substrate controls. To me, at that point, that has broken the chain of custody. The Department of Justice, from the notes I have, had to call to ask for specimens, the substrate specimens, and they didn't run them in parallel because they had to have packaged them at LAPD without handling the substrate control. If you think about it, if you're packing these things in a package and they're only mailing one, why would they handle it in parallel and then just not send the substrate control?
Objection, no foundation, Your Honor.
Overruled. But Mr. Scheck, I'm not comfortable with the terminology of chain of custody in this context.
Let me get it this way. In your work in paternity,
Yes.
do you have familiarity, is the term chain of custody used in terms of handling of evidence samples?
It is.
And how does that arise?
Well, in a paternity action, obviously, it's another legal action. You need to have documentation of every individual who's handled a specific item.
And the American Association of Blood Banks regulates your paternity lab?
Yes.
Do they have rules that incorporate the term chain of custody?
Yes.
Are you familiar with how that works?
Yes.
And in terms of DNA laboratories generally, are rules set up for handling items of evidence to preserve their integrity for testing?
Yes.
Are there such rules in your transplantation work?
Yes, and in clinical work, yes.
All right. And have you reviewed protocols of forensic laboratories that talk about ways that samples ought to be handled to preserve the integrity of evidence?
Yes.
Now, is it important in your judgment when implementing rules, and I'm asking you this now in your capacity as a DNA lab director, but how many people have you supervised, how many people work in the IAD laboratory?
There's approximately 40.
All right, and right now, specifically under you, how many technicians do you supervise?
I have 4.
And in terms of training people technical people to go through with the DNA process, how important is it for them to know the purpose of the procedures they're following in terms of their use as controls?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
How important is it to train personnel about the controls that they're using and why they're using them?
It's extremely important.
Why is that?
Well, protocols are there for a purpose, and they need to be followed. That's how you standardize and the testing result, and that's how you guarantee it's a valid, accurate result that can be relied upon. So it's important that they're trained in that protocol and that they follow that protocol.
Right. And incidentally, in terms of, for example, does that have application in terms of the use of gloves?
Yes, all aspects of how to handle the specimens and how to set up the testing and how to interpret the testing and so forth.
Well, is one purpose of wearing gloves to protect in a DNA laboratory, to protect the handler?
Yes.
And is another purpose to protect against cross-contamination?
Yes.
Now, have you reviewed the testimony of Mr. Fung and Ms. Mazzola with respect to what they knew about the purpose of the substrate controls.
Yes.
All right. And now, besides, so it would be fair, do you feel withdrawn? So, based on your review of the way samples were handled, in terms of distributing them and the way they were, the review of the testimony here about how the substrate controls were handled, are you comfortable with the assumption that the substrate and controls were run in parallel here?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Let me get back to it this way. In terms of in your review of the LAPD laboratory strips, in terms of contamination, what is the significance of the degree of contamination you found in the extraction control versus the amplification control?
Objection, asked and answered.
The significance is that it indicates that the area in which contamination is occurring in this laboratory is an early area, most likely in the DNA extraction or sample handling.
Now, besides your view that about the substrate, your views about the substrate controls being handled in parallel, the fact that negative controls don't always, clean negative controls don't always indicate contamination, and the notion of carrier. Do you have any evidence from review of the data that indicates that there was cross-contamination of DNA between samples handled by Mr. Yamauchi in this case?
I believe there is some indication of that.
And does this cross-contamination show up, or does this evidence show up not just in the way samples were handled at LAPD, but how they were typed then subsequently at DOJ and Cellmark?
Yes.
I would like to move to Dr. Gerdes, are you familiar with the fact that on June 15th, 1994, in the evidence processing room and at the serology lab, Mr. Yamauchi handled item number 12, blood drops recovered from the foyer of Mr. Simpson's home, and the reference sample from Nicole Brown Simpson and the reference sample from Ronald Goldman?
Yes.
Now, on this chart, there's could you explain what the
Sure.
code is over here?
Yeah, these indicate the typings for the three reference individuals, the DQ alpha and one locus, the GC locus of the polymarker gene system.
So those represent the genotypes for the three individuals here?
Yes.
So on the DQ alpha,
On the DQ alpha, there's a 1.1, 1.2 for Mr. Simpson. There's a 1.1, 1.1 for Nicole Brown Simpson, and there's a 1.34 for Ron Goldman.
and on the GC locus and the polymarker system, what are the types for these three individuals?
On the GC locus of the polymarker gene, it's a BC for Mr. Simpson, an AC for Nicole Brown Simpson, and an AA for Mr. Goldman.
Now, the next three boxes indicate something called LAPD typing sheet, cell mark typing sheet, and DOJ typing sheet. But what
Yeah.
are those?
These are the recorded results that were found on the typing sheets on those dates when these specific references were typed.
Now, let's move first to June 15th, 1994, when Mr. Yamauchi did this initial typing. I take it he recorded for the item number 12, the blood drops found in the foyer, Mr. Simpson's genotype 1.1, 1.2.
That's correct.
All right. Now, with respect to the reference sample, could you tell us what was recorded and also what you observed on the sheet?
Yes, it was recorded as a 1.1, 1.1. And on the actual typing, I can see a very faint 1.2.
All right. Now, I think we have to do some exhibit marking here, Your Honor. What are we up to as far as this board is concerned?
1308.
1308. I'd ask that this DNA hybridization sheet be marked 1308A.
So much.
And could you point that, direct us to the, If you want-
See the code to be sure.
please feel free to, you can approach the animal,
Thank you.
if I may.
Now, this isn't showing up very well up on the screen, but there's a very faint .2 in this area.
Could you please just, let's see, could you please,
Go up a little higher. If you look here, there's a shadow. If you look on the next strip, there isn't a shadow. It's very faint, but it's distinct, and there's a 1.2 right there.
okay, can we print that out, please? As 1308B. And Dr. Gerdes, did you, have you reviewed typing sheets from the Department of Justice and strips and become familiar with their nomenclature with respect to traces, faint traces, very faint, hints, etc.?
Yes.
All right, and is that an objective or a subjective set of distinctions in
Very
your opinion?
subjective. Very subjective.
To the best of your ability, could you write in under NBS reference sample and give your using this black pen, could you write in the genotype that you see there and how you would characterize it?
Based on my understanding of the testimony from the Department of Justice, I think they would characterize this as a hint of a 1.2.
Your Honor, before that happens, I have an objection to that being marked on the board in its current form. I believe I raised that to the court previously.
Actually, I think you ruled on this.
Or
Now, with respect to Mr. Goldman's reference sample, the LAPD records there a 1.34 and is the term very faint 1.1 what's on their record?
It's on their report, yes.
All right. Now, and you can see that very faint 1.1 on the strip itself.
Yes. Should I put the arrow on it?
And so we'll call the new arrow here,
It's right here.
okay. Make this 1308C. Your Honor, may I, if you could, maybe the simplest way to do this is, could we go back, this was 1308B, I believe, this is the print at. Could we make one print at where put NBS by the arrow where you're indicating the 1.2, and let's put RG on the right-hand side so we can identify the strips. Inside of the strip? No. Yeah, that one, right, NBS. And below that, we'll write RG. Oh, No, that's the wrong strip. Go up one. Yeah. Yeah. Is that correct, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay. Now, on the, and we'll print that ad as 1308B. Now, in the DQ alpha system, when one has the 4 allele is showing, and and there is a 1 allele there. Does that mean that means that dot that we've indicated there? We see in Mr. Goldman's sample there's a very dark dot that's 1.2, 1.34. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's this so-called masking problem with the 1.2 allele, correct?
That's correct, because this particular dot will detect a 1.2, 1.3, or a 4. It's not specific to the 1.2 only. So if there's a 1 dot as well, then you have to count the possibility that there is a 1.2 there. If there's a one dot and a 4.
Now, so in terms of Mr. Goldman's reference sample, what would that mean in terms of how you would call the existence of a 1.2?
Well, you have to consider the possibility, at least, that it had been masked, and it might be there.
So could you please draw there 1.2 and underneath the other box, possible?
Yes.
Is that your understanding as to...
Yes.
Okay. So, from looking here at the LAPD typing sheet, now, with respect to item number 12, is it your understanding, sir, that item number 12 were drops in Mr. Simpson's foyer that were the last blood drops collected on June 13th.
That's correct.
And is it your understanding that that item number 12 had sufficient DNA in it to get a strong band RFLP result at Cellmark?
Objection leading.
Sustain.
Do you know if they got an RFLP result at Cellmark?
Yes.
Was the concentration of the DNA in item number 12, certainly compared to the so-called Bundy blood drops, 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52, comparatively higher?
Same objection.
Sustain.
Well, do you know if Mr. Yamauchi handled item number 12 in the same time and location as he handled the reference samples from Nicole Brown Simpson and Mr. Goldman on June 15th?
Same
Yes, he did.
objection.
Overruled.
Right.
Yes, he did.
All right. Would these typing results be consistent? Well, what are the, with a cross-contamination of item number 12 with the two reference samples?
Same objection also calls for speculation.
Sustain.
All right. What do these results indicate to you?
Same objection.
Overruled.
These results are consistent with cross-contamination of the 1.2 from item 12 into Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman's reference samples.
Now, what is the, in terms of the PCR process, what is competition? What does that mean?
Well, if you're trying to amplify the DNA from two contributors, and there's a very large amount of one contributor and a small amount of the second contributor, the larger amount is going to tend to amplify faster, and therefore it will outcompete the smaller amount. So if they would have vast ratios, something in high concentration with something in low concentration, most likely the lower concentration contributor will have very weak signals.
So, aren't the reference samples from Mr. Goldman and Ms. Nicole Brown Simpson, wouldn't those be, by definition, high concentration?
Yes,
And yet still you see these alleles.
yes.
Now, in terms of the Ronald Goldman reference sample here, this 1.1,
Yes.
in theory, could that be consistent with the so-called DX artifact?
That is one of those situations, as we mentioned earlier, where you have a 1 dot because of the 1.3, and then the 1.1, and now you can't determine. It could be either or. It might be DX. On the other hand, you can't really say that it isn't a contaminant either.
But what about the 1.2 dot on Nicole Brown Simpson's reference sample? Is that an artifact or a contaminant?
That's a contaminant because the 1.2 doesn't have that kind of artifact, and if you see anything on there, that means there's DNA there.
Now let's move to the next typing of reference samples of Nicole Brown Simpson and Mr. Goldman. Was done at Cellmark on August 5th, 1994.
That's correct.
All right, and what's written on Defense 1308, are those what Cellmark recorded on their typing sheets?
Yes.
And first of all, were you able to observe, or do you have a photograph of these strips?
I believe I do. Actually, no, I don't. I have a Xerox is all I have with me of cell marks. No, I have the,
Yeah, the photograph.
I have it.
Yes. We mark this as 1308C.
1308C.
Yeah. Now, with respect to, these strips represent both the DQ alpha and what other system?
The polymarker system.
All right. Now, what can you say about the C dots in your observation of the reference samples from the Cole-Brown system and Ronald Goldman?
The C dots, which are specifically on the DQ alpha system, as you can see, are extremely light. On all three references.
And,
In fact, I don't see any C there at all, but it is recorded on their typing sheet as being present.
well, let's go through that. In other words, when you look at the actual photograph taken, you don't see a C dot.
I don't know.
But when the typing strips were developed at Cellmark, an analyst wrote something down saying that they actually saw a C dot.
Yes.
Now, would you indicate here the faint, you don't even see a C dot on this.
No, I don't.
And what's the significance of a light or non-visible C dot in terms of being able to see contaminants?
Well, the C dot is designed as an internal control of the system to tell you if you have enough DNA there. If you don't see a C dot, the user guide, the rules, if you will, tell you that this is not an interpretable result. You can't count on that typing because there's too little DNA there.
But would it be a fair statement that the fainter the C dot, the less likely you are to see low-level contaminants?
Absolutely, yes, because the other way the C dot can be faint is the last step in the process is to develop it, just like you would develop film. You watch this develop. And if you stop it too early, underdevelop it, then you won't see the C, and you also won't see light dots, other light dots that happen, that may have been there. They won't show up.
Now, could you please mark faint C then? How would you characterize? Faint C is what Cellmark put on its
How
records?
about C question mark?
All right, please put that on both reference samples. Now, was there, however, what is the significance of the faint B recorded on the polymarker system for Nicole Brown Simpson?
Well, the significance of that is a second gene system. And you can cross-check one gene system with a second gene system. And remember, Mr. Simpson has a BC, and Nicole Brown Simpson has an AC. So the presence of a B here is consistent with the B from Mr. Simpson finding its way into Nicole Brown Simpson and then not being detected until it gets to Cellmark, where they use a second gene system.
Objection, move to strike speculation, Your Honor.
Sustain. Answer stricken.
All right. The B, in terms of the polymarker system, is that a contaminant or an artifact?
That's a contaminant.
Let's move on to the next time the reference samples were typed at the Department of Justice.
Yes.
Was that on December 31st, 1994?
Yes.
All right. And what do the typing sheets for the Department of Justice indicate?
The Department of Justice recorded on Nicole Brown Simpson a 1.1, 1.1 with a faint trace 1.3 and a trace of 1.2.
All right. Now, with respect to Mr. Goldman, what did they record?
Mr. Goldman, they recorded a 1.34 with a faint trace 1.1.
All right. And given the rules of interpretation, what does that mean about a 1.2?
You would also have to consider the fact that in this setup that there might be a masked 1.2.
Could you please write 1.2 possible under there? Would this data from the Department of Justice, well, let me start again. Is that 1.2 trace on the Cole-Brown-Simpson reference sample, is that an artifact or contaminant?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
In your opinion, based on the principles of the DQ alpha system as you understand it, what does the appearance of that 1 point dot indicate?
Same objection.
Overruled.
It indicates contamination.
Now, with respect to the 1.3, could that be an artifact?
In this case, again, that is known to have a cross-hybridization problem under certain circumstances. And the difficulty here is we also have the one allele showing up again because of the 1.1, and therefore you can't really tell if this is an artifact or real.
And when you said the circumstances where 1.3 is an artifact are what kind of circumstances?
With high level of DNA, which this may be because it's a reference sample, and the fact that there's also the 1 dot showing.
In your opinion, sir, does this pattern of typings from these three laboratories, is that consistent with evidence of cross-contamination at LAPD that was subsequently picked up in typings at Cellmark and DOJ?
Objection leading calls for speculation.
Sustained.
What, in your opinion, is the significance of this pattern of typings?
Objection calls for speculation.
Overruled.
My interpretation of this pattern is it has two possible explanations. The first explanation is that there is cross-contamination of Mr. Simpson's blood into Nicole Brown Simpson or Ronald Goldman, which is then subsequently typed by the two laboratories that LAPD sent their specimens to. The second explanation is that there are possibly contaminants and artifacts that are found at LAPD that are also found at Cellmark and also found at DOJ, and those artifacts just happen to be consistent with the contamination of the cross-contamination pattern.
So in other words, there would have to be at LAPD, with respect to Nicole Brown Simpson, that 1.2 would have to be LAPD contaminating it,
Yes,
but and the 1.1 would be an artifact.
yes,
And then, with respect to the Cellmark typing, the B would have to be an independent contamination at Cellmark.
yes.
Objection leading calling for speculation.
Sustained. Answer stricken.
All right. What would that B have to be if this weren't your first explanation, that is, cross-contamination at LAPD that was picked up to the other two labs, but a series of coincidental contaminations and artifact, what would that B in the polymarker system have to be?
Same objection as to, I'm sorry, calling for speculation.
Sustained.
Well, what would the B in the polymarker system have to be if this were not cross-contamination that started at LAPD, but another explanation?
Same objection.
Overruled.
That B would have to be a contaminant that coincidentally is consistent with cross-contamination from Mr. Simpson to Nicole Brown Simpson.
And what about the DOJ typing? What about that 1.2? What would that have to be if this were not cross-contamination that started at LAPD?
That would have to be, again, coincidental appearance of the 1.2 that is consistent with cross-contamination from Mr. Simpson's blood into Nicole Brown Simpson's.
And then the 1.1, what could that be?
The 1 point,
1.1 in Mr. Goldman's sample.
in Mr. Goldman's sample, it's the same answer. As it would have to be a DX or an artifact that's consistent with cross-contamination.
Thank you. Dr. Gerdes, what effect does that data have on your view with respect to the efficacy of substrate controls that were used at LAPD in this case?
Objection, no foundation, calls for speculation beyond the expertise of the witness.
Overruled.
It undermines my confidence in those controls, since there is some evidence here that the cross-contamination occurred.
Now, I'd like to move on now to, did you examine the data concerning typings made at the Los Angeles Police Department and the Department of Justice on samples that were collected from the Bronco console on June 14th?
Yes,
So there was one set of samples collected on June 14th, is that your understanding?
yes,
And then after that, it's your understanding what happened to that vehicle? Have you been following the testimony on that?
yes, I have,
You reviewed the records on that?
yes,
And you're aware of the fact that it was released to Vertel's tow yard without a special protection for biological evidence box being checked?
yes,
And you're aware that it went to Vertel's for a period of time?
yes,
And you're aware that the car was broken into at least once?
yes,
Sustain.
All right.
Also misstates there.
It does. Sustain.
Car was broken into, there's been evidence the car was broken into once.
No, there hasn't.
I'll withdraw all of this. Have you reviewed the data just from the June 14th collection?
yes, I have.
Now, I'd like to move to another. Mark, I think it's 1309.
1309.
And I'd like to mark a photograph, and forgive me, I think that a copy of this photograph may have been introduced as a prosecution exhibit, but I can't figure out which one it was.
All right, proceed.
Try it again. Make this 1309A. Now,
I'm sorry, could I see it, Your Honor?
oh, sure. Brian, will you approach just a minute? So- 1309A represent those series of strips?
You want to show it to him up
Yeah.
close?
I think he knows it.
These are items from the Bronco, taken, DNA items from the Bronco. They were typed at Department of Justice.
Pictures of the Department of Justice
Pictures of the
strips?
strips, yes.
And you also have their scoring sheet with respect to that?
Yes, I do.
And on 1308 itself, have we taken certain strips, enlarged them, and then made, and then taken DOJ typing sheet data?
Yes.
And in fact, in the upper left-hand corner here of 1308, we see another picture of 1308A, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, LAPD item number 30, is that a stain from the, blood stain from the Bronco console?
That's correct.
And is item 31 also a stain, swatch taken from the Bronco console on June 14th?
That's correct.
These are all items taken June 14th.
That's correct.
And QC 816, what is that?
That is a quality control specimen, and at the Department of Justice, they take known samples from known individuals and run them through in a blind fashion so that they can tell if the typing is being done correctly. So this would be a quality control numbered 816 that would have a particular type, and it would be run as a control at the time they did their typing.
And what is this strip marked positive control?
The positive control is the control that is incorporated or packaged with the kit. It's a DNA that is a 1.14 DNA that's run just to check the strips.
All right. Now, is there one control in this series of strips that is not included in this large chart?
I believe so.
And which one is that?
The extraction blank, is that what you're talking about? Yes.
Okay. And that control had no, what, did that control have any evidence of activity?
No, that's the DNA extraction blank, and in this particular case, it looks clean.
Now, what was the typing called by the Department of Justice for LAPD item 30?
Item 30 was recorded as a 1.1, 1.2 with a hint of 1.3.
And that, in this case, has been called as a genotype consistent with Mr. Simpson, is that correct?
That's correct.
By the Department of Justice.
By the Department of Justice.
Now, LAPD item number 31, what was the call made by the Department of Justice and testified to by Mr. Sims in this case?
They recorded this item as a mixture of a 1.1, 1.2 as a large contributor and a minor contributor of a 1.34.
That is in fact what appears in their typing sheet?
Yes.
All right. And was the 1.34 called by the Department of Justice as being a genotype consistent with Mr. Goldman?
It was.
All right. And to make that call, what must the analyst say about that 1.3 allele or dot? Is it, in terms of being it a real allele or a contaminant?
In order for it to be recorded as a real allele or a typable allele, it should be greater in intensity than the C dot.
But in terms of, was that 1.3 called as a real allele or real DNA?
It was considered in terms of the report because it was mentioned as a minor contributor. Yes, it was.
Now, on the quality assurance control, QC 816, what is the expected genotype for that?
expected genotype on that quality control was a 1.2, 1.2.
All right? And what was recorded by the Department of Justice in terms of the alleles or the dots seen on that strip?
They recorded, in addition, they recorded a hint of a 1.3 and a 1.1 dot.
All right? And looking at the positive control, what's the expected genotype for that?
The expected genotype is a 1.14,
And what did they find?
and they found a 1.3, and they recorded that as a hint of a 1.3.
Now, in view of the 1.3, or the hint of 1.3 that is recorded on QC 816, and the hint of 1.3 recorded on the positive control, in your opinion, well, what is the purpose of these controls in terms of the appearance of dots on other strips in the same run?
The purpose of the controls is to ensure that the typing was run appropriately and all the controls worked. In this particular case, this hint of 1.3 on both of these strips indicates, at this point, we don't know what it indicates. It indicates either there's an artifact, the 1.3, remember, can do that, and we have a presence of a 1 allele, so we can't determine whether that's the case or not. It could be a contaminant, or it could be an error in this particular run in the way that they ran their hybridization.
And incidentally, you said the 1.3, when it appears as an artifact as opposed to a real foreign DNA contaminant, how much DNA has to be put into the template?
Well, in order for that to be the explanation, you need greater than 6 nanograms of DNA.
Now, in view of the 1.3 showing up as hints in the quality assurance sample 816 and the positive control, in your opinion, is it scientifically acceptable to call the 1.3 on LAPD item 31 as a real allele?
Objection, lack of expertise on the part of the witness.
Overruled.
Well, you can't call that allele because your controls are showing weak signals similar to that. You have no confidence because the control has failed as to whether or not we have a similar thing going on this particular item. You can't ignore the 1.3 on your controls and then count it on something that was run during the same run as being real. There's no way scientifically to determine at that point whether that's the case or not.
In terms of the Bronco console and samples that were collected on June 14, 1995, other than LAPD item number 31, is there any other DNA results from that console that is consistent with Mr. Goldman's genotype?
Objection, leading and argumentative.
Sustained.
Is there any other DNA result from swatches taken from the console on June 14th, ooh, that's wrong. Your Honor, may I make a correction on the board?
You may.
You have the black. All right, let the record reflect on 1308, I am changing 61495 to 61494.
Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the DNA results from both the Los Angeles Police Department and the Department of Justice, from bloodstains taken on the console, from the console, that were collected on June 14th, not August 26th, but June 14th, are there, other than LAPD item number 31, are there any other results that are consistent with Mr. Goldman's genotype?
No.
So as far as the June 14th collection is concerned, item 31 is the only evidence that's consistent with Mr. Goldman's genotype on that Bronco console.
That's correct.
And it's your opinion, sir, that the controls failed as far as LAPD item 31 is concerned,
That's correct.
and that this cannot be called.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of development length, could you indicate what that is?
as I explained, the last step in these strips is to allow that dot to develop, and it's just like developing film. It's not exactly the same, but that's a good analogy, so that as you develop, you can see the dot getting darker and darker. And the longer you wait, the darker the dot will become. And when you stop it, then that stops the process.
Now, in the LAPD protocol, withdrawn, in the Department of Justice protocol, what is the time frame that they indicate they will develop the strips in? How many minutes?
20 to 30 minutes.
All right. And in this particular DOJ typing sheet, did they indicate how long these particular strips were developed?
Yes,
And what was that?
25 minutes.
Mark this as Defense 1310.
1310.
I have two smaller pictures, Your Honor, that correspond with, that are also on this board, one of which I'll mark 1310A.
And these are DQ alpha strips from October 31st.
That is correct, Your Honor. And 1310B.
And those will be DQ alpha strips from December 31st.
Thank you, that's correct. Now, Dr. Gerdes,
Certainly.
LAPD item number 52, is that one of the Bundy blood drops?
Yes, it is.
Is that the Bundy blood drop that Cellmark got an RFLP result with between 25 and 50, or around 25 nanograms of human DNA?
That's correct.
Now, what was the typing at the Department of Justice with respect to LAPD item 52?
For item 52, they recorded a 1.1, 1.2 with a 1.3 C trace,
C minus?
C minus.
What does that mean in their nomenclature?
The C minus,
Yes.
actually, I'm not sure what the C minus means.
All right. But what does trace mean?
Trace simply means that there's a very small amount. C minus, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Pardon me. C minus means it's less than the C dot.
Or that's what they've called.
That's what they call it.
All right. And what was the genotype reported in this case for LAPD item 52? What did the DOJ report as?
They reported a 1.1, 1.2.
All right. Now, let us assume that DNA from the item number 52 degraded through bacteria and was subsequently, those swatches were subsequently cross-contaminated with DNA from Mr. Simpson. And the genotype of the original source of that swatch included a 1.3,
Yes.
would in theory this typing be consistent with that kind of mixture?
Objection assumes facts not in evidence,
Sustain.
no foundation.
Sustain.
If one were to regard this 1.3 dot on LAPD item 52 from the DOJ typing as a real allele, just asking you to assume that,
Yes.
what would this be in terms of, would this be a mixture?
Objection calls for speculation, assumes facts not in evidence.
Overruled.
Yes, it would. It would be a mixture of these three, of individuals, all possible combinations of individuals with those three alleles.
All right. Now, in terms of the various systems that we're using here, DQ alpha, D1S80, and RFLP, which of the systems is the most sensitive?
In terms of detecting DNA, the DQ alpha system.
All right. So if there's small amounts of DNA, it will show up first on the DQ alpha system.
Yes.
All right, doctor, would you take half a step back, please?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, what was recorded with respect to, what is QC 877?
That is another quality control sample that happened to be run with this particular run.
All right. And what is the positive control?
Again, that's the positive control, the 1.14 that comes with the kit.
All right. And what did the Department of Justice indicate they found with respect to the 1.3 dot on QC 877?
Once again, they record a trace of a 1.3 on this quality control sample, and a hint trace of the 1.3 on the positive control.
Now, in the Department of Justice, withdrawn, did the Department of Justice subsequently rehybridize item number 52?
They did.
All right. And when was that?
That was on 12/31/94.
All right. And what results did they record?
On rehybridizing, they recorded a 1.1, 1.2 with a 1.3 very faint trace.
All right. Now, can you see that very faint trace in this picture?
No.
All right. Is that something that was recorded by them when they first saw the strip?
Yes.
So by their own records, what are they indicating about the 1.3 when they rehybridized it?
Well, they're indicating that they saw something on their record, and but I don't see it on the strip.
All right. Now, do the records indicate from the Department of Justice how long they developed this rehybridization on December 31st, 1994?
Yes, 22 minutes.
All right. Is there any indication of how long the strips that were hybridized on October 31st, 1994 were developed?
I couldn't find any record of it on that sheet.
Could you please indicate, not indicated on those brackets? Now, the longer the development time, what happens in terms of these dots?
They become more intense, especially faint dots. The faint dots will begin to appear.
So, would it be fair to say that if you develop the strips less time, as opposed to a greater time, you're less likely to see faint dots?
Objection leading.
Sustain.
All right. What happens if you develop within a framework, a bracketed framework of 20 to 30 minutes, in terms of developing these strips? and the likelihood of seeing faint dots? Is it greater? When is it greater and when is it less?
The dots will be more intense at 30 minutes and less intense or lighter in 20 minutes.
So it's a gradation. The longer the development, the more you see it.
Yes.
Now, in your judgment, do you have an opinion with respect to the limitations of the DQ alpha system and the protocol as implemented here in the Department of Justice with respect to development length?
Objection vague.
Yes, I think that the development length should be standardized to a greater degree in order to provide for more reliable and for cross comparison of two different strips. They have to be developed at the same time in order for you to really compare the two.
Is there a problem, sir, with dots appearing when you develop them for longer periods and then disappearing when you develop for shorter periods?
Objection leading, also
Sustain.
beyond expertise.
Dr. Gerdes, in terms of the DQ alpha system looks at what gene?
Looks at the DQ alpha gene.
All right.
HLA, DQ alpha.
In your laboratory, do you use systems to detect the DQ alpha gene?
Yes, I do.
What systems are they?
They're a dot blot system. It's not this particular kit, but it's a similar dot blotting system.
What kind is it called? This is called reverse dot blot.
This is direct dot blotting.
That's what you use?
Yes.
Are you developing PCR systems
Yes.
that involve direct dot blotting?
At the present time, we're using them. We're not really developing them at the moment, but I have in the past, yes.
D1S80, what kind of a system is that?
That's a short tandem repeat system for PCR.
And with respect to the CMV, did you develop a PCR-based system to detect that?
Yes.
Do you have any qualms at all about your expertise as a molecular biologist to interpret the protocols and the operation of the DQ alpha system?
Counsel, the objection that was sustained was leading.
Oh. It wasn't as to expertise? Okay. Thank you. Dr. Gerdes, what is your view? Let's do this in our remaining minutes. Could we put we're running out of time. Maybe we could, I could even dragoon some people into Hold'em. Maybe that would do it.
I don't know, I think your colleagues didn't like that terminology. They'll volunteer. All right, Mr. Harris. Thank you, sir.
All right,
Making sure you don't block off the court reporter.
let's just try it this way. With 13.089, this is the Bronco console board, and item number 31. Did this 1.3 dot that I'm pointing to on LAPD item 31, how did they call that?
They call that as a real allele.
Did they call that as a contaminant?
No.
Did they call that as an artifact?
No.
They call that as real?
Yes.
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Is this 1.3 the basis of calling a genotype consistent with Mr. Goldman in the Bronco?
It is.
Is this the only evidence from the Bronco console as the collection was done on June 14th, 1994, that has a genotype consistent with Mr. Goldman and the Bronco?
Objection asked and answered.
All right, answer will stand.
Could
We
you
did,
please-
we did cover that once already, though.
I understand. Could you please, I have a circle here, Your Honor. Could you please put over that 1.3 and write in this circle, called real? Is that permissible, Your Honor?
Yes.
Right over this?
No.
To cover it?
Put it perhaps over it, to the side. You know, maybe
Below it?
below it and pointing upwards. Okay. Now, ask you with this marker. Oh, I'm sorry. Now, with respect to the, pointing now to LAPD item 52,
Yes,
pointing now to the dot that's 1.3.
yes.
How did the department call that in terms of whether that was real or an artifact?
Artifact,
Not real?
not real.
Could you please, on this sticker, and with an arrow, write "not real" and point downwards? Comparing these two analyses, in your opinion, as a DNA laboratory director, as a molecular biologist, as an individual that develops PCR typing systems, are these two calls scientifically consistent?
No, they're not.
All right, I think this is a good place to stop our next thing.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the afternoon. Please remember all of my admonitions to you. Don't discuss this case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. As far as the jury is concerned, we'll stand in recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. All right, thank you, counsel. And Dr. Gerdes, you're ordered to return tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. All right, we'll stand in recess.